Let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're looking at the ultimate historical breakup. We're going to unpack the wildly fascinating story of exactly why 13 fiercely independent colonies decided to just reject British rule completely and walk away from their own mother country.
If you were sitting around in the mid-1700s, it would have sounded completely crazy to imagine these diverse colonies actually banding together to fight the very empire they considered their home. Why fight your own mother country? Honestly, it went against everything that made sense for them at the time.
To put things into perspective, let's look at the reality on the ground around 1732. Before the Revolution, these 13 colonies were not some big, happy, unified family. Not at all. They had completely different economies. The South was largely driven by agriculture and the transatlantic slave trade, while the North was focused more on domestic service and industrial trades, though also utilizing enslaved labor. They were set up in totally different ways, and they honestly held some pretty intense prejudices against one another. The one single thing tying them together, their shared British identity. They looked across the Atlantic and thought, yep, that's our home.
Section 1. The cracks in the relationship.
So how does a bond that strong start to break? Well, picture this. Britain and the colonists had just fought side by side. They won a really bitter war against France in the 1750s, and the colonists were absolutely thrilled. Their immediate goal was to push west into all this amazing, newly acquired territory. But the king drops a bombshell. He enacts this strict proclamation line to completely block them. He was terrified that colonial expansion would just spark fresh, incredibly expensive wars with the native populations. But to the colonists, this felt like a massive slap in the face, a literal blockade to their own opportunity.
And the hits just kept coming. On top of restricting where they could live, Britain was drowning in massive debts from that French war. Parliament takes a look at the books and decides, hey, the American colonies should probably chip in for this war we just won together. And just like that, they start rolling out a wave of brand new colonial taxes. Now, here's what's absolutely crucial to understand. This wasn't just about the money. This sparked a massive ideological shift. There was a slow, steady growth of frustration over the very idea that men sitting in a room back in Britain, thousands of miles across an ocean, should have the power to rule them, dictate their finances, and basically control their daily lives.
Section 2. Boston boils over.
All this simmering frustration was desperately looking for a spark, and it found the ultimate powder keg in Boston, Massachusetts. This place was packed with independent thinkers who, quite frankly, hated being told what to do. Just think about the rapid escalation. In 1765, Boston colonists start rioting in the streets against these British taxes. Fast forward 5 years to 1770, and British redcoats fire into a mob, leaving 5 civilians dead in what we now call the Boston Massacre. By 1773, as a giant protest against trade controls, men literally dumped 300 chests of tea into the harbor, the famous Boston Tea Party. Parliament is furious and declares Massachusetts an open rebellion, and by 1775, actual deadly armed conflict erupts.
Which brings us to a very grim number: 8. In 1775, just outside of Boston, a massive force of 700 British soldiers clashed with armed civilian colonists. Shots rang out, and 8 colonists were killed on the spot. This was it. This officially sparked a war, forcing the colonies to scramble, form an army, and put a guy named George Washington in charge of the whole thing.
But here is the wildest part about all of this. The colonists were now locked in a brutal military conflict, a revolution, against their own government. But incredibly, most of them still didn't think independence was actually the answer. They were quite literally shooting at British soldiers, but they hadn't even embraced the idea of a true independence movement yet.
Section 3. The viral breakup letter.
So how do you get a bunch of hesitant colonists to finally pull the plug? Enter the 18th century version of a viral sensation. In January 1776, Thomas Paine drops a smash hit pamphlet called Common Sense. And he asks a question with such bold, flawless logic that it changed everything. What kind of sense does it make for a small island to rule a continent? It was brilliant. That single argument just completely flipped public opinion and got everybody on board with declaring true, total independence.
Riding this massive wave of public momentum, representatives from all 13 colonies hightailed it to Philadelphia. First, they meet up. Second, they assign Virginia delegate Thomas Jefferson to draft what is essentially the ultimate historic breakup letter. And finally, on July 4th, 1776, all 13 colonies officially step up and adopt the Declaration of Independence.
Section 4. A very messy breakup.
Now, we all know that just declaring yourselves a new nation on a piece of paper doesn't magically make the shooting stop. This was not some instant happy moment. The reality was incredibly grueling.
The British king saw this declaration as flat-out treason, and his response was to send 32,000 heavily armed troops straight to New York to crush the rebellion. The colonists now had to fight a brutal, bloody war just to preserve the independence they had literally just claimed.
Realizing there was absolutely no way they could win a toe-to-toe fight against the world's reigning superpower, the Americans had to look outward. Global alliances started shifting overnight. The United States was desperately seeking military and financial aid just to keep their heads above water. Luckily for them, European empires like France and Spain were more than happy to step in. Why? Pure strategy. They were heavily incentivized to weaken their massive rival Britain, while also opening up brand new, lucrative economic ties with this emerging nation.
And that European support was an absolute game-changer. Backed by French military and financial muscle, George Washington somehow navigated 5 absolutely brutal years of war. Tens of thousands died, but finally, in 1781, Washington successfully boxed in the British forces at Yorktown. Ironically, that's just a few miles from Jamestown, the very first permanent British settlement. With nowhere to go, the British forces had to surrender.
Now, the aftermath of this surrender gives us one of the absolute best, most amusing historical artifacts you will ever hear about. The British Parliament and the public were just so completely over the cost of this endless war that they decided to cut their losses. But the breakup was so incredibly humiliating for Britain that the official treaty painting marking American independence, it was never finished. The British delegates were literally too ashamed to even sit down and pose for the portrait. You just can't make that up.
Meanwhile, back in America, the dust settles, the war is won, and the real work begins. They had to build a country that would actually last, to ensure this whole experiment wouldn't just fall apart in a decade. So they sit down and write a constitution outlining a completely brand new government structure. They introduce this totally novel concept of having a president in charge instead of a king. And then, in 1789, they get together and unanimously elect their war hero, George Washington, to take the wheel.
Which leaves us with a really profound question to end this explainer on. How exactly did the chaotic, incredibly messy breakup of 13 deeply divided colonies ultimately forge a unified continental power, a power governed by a constitution strong enough to hold a remarkably diverse continent together for 2.5 centuries? It's a massive testament to how the totally unimaginable idea of rejecting British rule somehow laid an unshakable foundation for a completely new kind of nation. Keep thinking on that one, and keep exploring the past.